Today we are going to be looking at ESPN fantasy football drafts and the average draft position at which players are going at. And this is going to give you guys the cheat code on how to win when you're drafting an ESPN leagues. So, Dave, first thing we're going to do is take a look at some undervalued players on the ESPN app. Why don't you start us off here with Amari Cooper, wide receiver for the Cleveland Browns?
Yeah, Amari Cooper. I feel like this is like year 26 of us just talking about Amari Cooper being a value in drafts for whatever reason. Like
He is
people just,
58 years old. Yeah.
but like for whatever reason, like Amari Cooper just perennially slept on, and he's coming off of his best season as a pro last year, 1,250 yards, averaged over 17 yards per reception. Had the second most targets of his, or I'm sorry, third most targets of his career. And right now, looking at how he's getting drafted on ESPN, we at Football Guys are saying that he is the 48th overall pick, meaning he should be a fourth round pick. On ESPN, he's getting drafted 68th overall. So this is kind of what we talked about like early on in the audio only portion of this show. You want to play ADP to some extent. We're not saying that you should draft Amari Cooper in the fourth round, but considering on ESPN, he's typically getting drafted in round 6. That's where you kind of maybe reach around early for him, knowing that you're still getting a great value there, drafting him in round 5. Now, the concerns with Amari Cooper probably have to do with Deshaun Watson. We know that people don't like Deshaun Watson and they don't like the Browns. We've also got the late season breakout from David Njoku last year. All of that kind of bleeds into this depressed price on Amari Cooper right now. But at the end of the day, he has just provided nothing but high-end wide receiver 2 production for the last few seasons. We know that he is the unquestioned wide receiver 1 here in Cleveland. Drafting him in round 5, easy pick to make on ESPN.
Yeah, I think in general, Amari Cooper is just really undervalued. We, like you always say, we have to embrace the variance with players like this, and we've seen he's got not just week winning upside, but playoff week winning upside. We saw essentially league winning upside last season, and Amari Cooper's a guy that I'm more than happy to take in the fourth round. But the fact that he is going at pick 68, 20 picks later, that's nuts. It's absolutely nuts.
I snuck into the playoffs last year as the 6th seed, and I had Breece Hall and Amari Cooper on that team. I gotta say, man, have you ever won a championship as the 6th seed? Because it feels pretty sweet, and I got to do that
Does it
last
feel
year.
better than 1 seed?
I think it does. I mean, like having just like
It's
a
a magical
juggernaut
ride.
and just running through, yeah, but like sneaking in, like feeling like you don't even deserve to be there, and then just like upset, and winning the league. That was pretty sweet.
All right, well, we've got a few more undervalued players for you guys on ESPN fantasy drafts. But before we get into that, I want to remind you guys, we've got a ton of ways for you to enjoy this show. The first is on youtube.com/@footballguysfantasy. And if you're watching the video currently, please remember to like this video, comment down below with some of your favorite players that you're looking to draft or players that you're avoiding. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. That way you can get all of our upcoming episodes. And we've got a giveaway for our listener league for the podcast audio version only. Okay, we're going to be announcing 2 winners next Monday, August 19th. The way that you can enter to be in the listener league is to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. Okay, it's Apple Podcast exclusive. You leave the review there, you take a screenshot, and you send that to abrown@footballguys.com. All right, that's abrown@footballguys.com. Dave, I'm going to give you my undervalued player, the first one at least. It's Jaylen Waddle, wide receiver for the Miami Dolphins. And as Football Guys staff, we've got him as our consensus 33rd player, meaning he should probably be going in the 3rd round. However, on ESPN Average Draft Position, he is going 49th, early 5th round. If there is a way that I could get Jaylen Waddle
That's
potentially
insane,
as the
dude.
5th player
Crazy.
on my team, I feel like I'm going to win the league right then and there. A difference of 16 spots is absolutely nuts. And when we're looking at it this way, Dave, like we talked about how we're seeing more running backs go earlier on that app. Let me go through rounds 1 and 2 with you. We're seeing 10 running backs versus 12 wide receivers. That's not that common to see that kind of split between the positions through the first 2 rounds. And it's just, to me, we end up seeing all these really good wide receivers like Jaylen Waddle, or like I mentioned before, Deebo Samuel, falling to the 4th and 5th round. It's honestly, it's very surprising. And Jaylen Waddle, This is a guy who was wide receiver 16 as a rookie, wide receiver 7 in the season after that with Tyreek Hill on the team. He was injured a lot in 2023, and we talked about this. How do you mentally prepare for drafting an injured player? He didn't get to play all that often. He was leaving games early. He only played 70% of the snaps in 6 games in 2023, which was why we saw the production drop off. We see the touchdown drop off from 8 to 4 touchdowns. It just wasn't the same season for him. And I do think that to an extent, we need to be able to throw that away. He finished as the wide receiver 20 last season, and this year he's getting drafted as the wide receiver 19. We're basing his value solely off of last year and saying he's probably not going to be healthy again. He's probably not going to score touchdowns again, when that I don't think that's really the case here. We're kind of betting on a negative outlier here for Jaylen Waddle, which is so weird. He's my wide receiver 15 in my rankings. Dave, I think he might be even higher for you, probably closer to like wide receiver 10, if I remember correctly. So getting
Wide
him
receiver
in the
11.
5th round, yeah, wide receiver 11. So getting him in the early 5th or even late 4th to me is just phenomenal value.
Yeah, I just wrote an article titled Jaylen Waddle, a wide receiver 1, disguised as a wide receiver 2. And that's what he is. Like, he's given us wide receiver 1 production. And I think, I don't know if you use the term casual drafters or what term you used earlier. Like, I don't want it to sound derogatory, but the bigger the platform, the more inexperienced and casual drafters you're going to have on there. And ESPN is a big dog. No surprise there. We're talking about a Disney
Just for
company
the
here that
moment,
everybody plays on. Yeah.
which for the moment, we applaud you guys for all jumping in. We want more of the quote casual
Yeah.
people playing the sport. The bigger the sport gets, the bigger this game gets, the better it is for all of us. The rising tide lifts all boats. So please, everyone keep jumping into these apps and keep playing fantasy football. Sorry, Dave. I just wanted to get on the soapbox for a
Yeah.
second. Keep going.
But I think, there's so many just outdated philosophies that a lot of drafters probably have that are causing Jaylen Waddle to get pushed down. They say, well, Tyreek Hill is there. So, he can't be the wide receiver 1 on his team. Why would I draft him this high? And they say, well, they've got a really good run game. Like, they're going to run the ball a lot. Why would I want the wide receiver 2 on a run first team? I'm sure there's some analysis seeping into this ADP where it's just like, yeah, that Tua Tagovailoa guy, I don't know about him. And all of those things have been disproven over the last couple of years, but I think people still hold on to those ideologies. And the reality is, we know that this is going to be a team that runs a ton of plays. Over the last 2 years, no quarterback has averaged more passing yards per game than Tua Tagovailoa. Like, they are going to run a lot of plays. Tua Tagovailoa has proved that he can support a very pass-friendly offense. And then we also know that this target tree is hyper funneled through 2 guys. Like, don't get me wrong, Geno Smith, I'm excited about him as like a late round dart throw, what he can do in this offense. But at the end of the day, we know the majority of the passing attempts are going to be consolidated to either Tyreek Hill or Jaylen Waddle. So we've seen different types of seasons from Jaylen Waddle. We've seen him be an inefficient target hog. Seen him be a not quite heavily utilized guy who could be the most efficient wide receiver in the league. And last year we saw the usage and the efficiency both near the top of his position, and he was injured. So Jaylen Waddle is a healthy season away from just absolutely smashing this year. And it's not out of the question that Tyreek Hill could be the overall wide receiver 1, and Jaylen Waddle could still be a top 8 wide receiver alongside him. So, yeah, give me all the Jaylen Waddle. Crazy to me. Did you say round 5 or 6 that he's getting drafted?
Yeah, early round 5 is where he's going. Pick 49. So the first pick of round 5.
Yeah, and I'd be comfortable taking Jaylen Waddle at the end of the second round. The nice thing is you don't have to. If you're playing on ESPN, you can wait until round 4. Like, load up with, 2 good running backs and a good wide receiver, or 2 good wide receivers and a running back, and then still add a potential top 10 wide receiver as your wide receiver 3, or, just your 4th general pick. That's crazy to me.
Yeah, and what's interesting is just not to directly compare them, but that we are so willing to draft the second wide receiver, quote, on the Rams, Puka Nacua,
Yeah.
so high, so high. So it's interesting where we kind of do the mental gymnastics where this guy is not as valuable as the next guy. It's football, fantasy football is just a game of psychology. All right, Dave. Next player on here, you want to talk about Diontae Johnson, wide receiver for the Carolina Panthers.
Yeah, and this is another one where it's just like, we start looking at this ADP and it's just shocking to me because, we look at our consensus rankings, we look at underdog rankings, and then all of a sudden you check this out and you see that Deontay Johnson is going as the 90th player off the board we've got him ranked as the 79th player off the board. And my individual rankings have him even higher than that. So I've got him as the 64th player off the board. So that is a huge value for Deontay Johnson right there. We know what this guy can do. Last year, in air yard share, he was 13th in the league. Dominator rating, which is the amount of receiving production that went to him based on his team's passing by, he was third in the league. That was playing on an offense with Pat Fryermuth, albeit a little bit injured, and George Pickens. He's still third in the league in dominator rating. This is a guy who has changed up the way that he's played football over the last couple of years. His target depth has grown in 3 consecutive seasons. He's catching passes deeper downfield. He's now starting to make more plays after the catch, had his highest yards after the catch per reception of his career last year. And believe it or not, he can score touchdowns. We finally saw it last year after that insane touchdown drought that he went on. So this is a guy who gets valuable targets deep downfield, draws a ton of them, makes plays after the catch, and can score touchdowns. And now he's on an offense that we expect to be better with Dave Canales kind of injecting some hope into this Panthers offense after what we saw last year. And Alfredo, you talked about it a couple of weeks ago. We heard their game plan. They asked Dave Canales, what do we expect from this passing game? And he said, we're just wanting to know, where's Diontae Johnson at on the field? It wouldn't surprise me one bit if he finishes the year with 150 to 160 targets and potentially gives us a top 15, top 12 fantasy finish. And you're drafting this guy right now for so cheap on ESPN. Like I said, I've got him as the 64th player off the board. Our Football Guys consensus rankings have him as 79th. And I personally have him as, and ESPN has him as the 90th player off the board. So just a huge value on ESPN there for Diontae Johnson.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy to sit here and think that Deontay Johnson, we can go ahead and draft him in the 8th round on ESPN, but you and I are willing to draft him probably in the 6th round and go 2 rounds ahead on this play. There, you don't come across players like this where you're going to get volume, where that they are the linchpin of their entire offense. Now, how good is that offense? That remains to be seen. But we do know that the wide receiver 1 on a Dave Canales offense has been pretty darn good for fantasy. And I'm perfectly fine grabbing that in the 6th round. So to think that we can get him in the 8th on ESPN, that's absolutely a cheat code. All right, my next guy I want to talk about here is Christian Kirk, wide receiver for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And right now on Football Guys, he is the consensus 58th player going in the 5th round. On ESPN, he is 87th. So we're seeing quite a big difference there of nearly 30 picks. Okay, more than 2 rounds difference here for Christian Kirk. When we take a look at last season, wide receiver 36 in points per game on the season, I think that's what a lot of people are remembering. But we do need a little more context. We do need some more nuance on that. He left a few games early due to injury. Okay. We know that he is still the wide receiver 1 for Jacksonville. That has not changed. Calvin Ridley is gone. They also lose Zay Jones. They bring in Gabe Davis, who I get it. He's had some big plays in the past. They bring in Brian Thomas, who, yes, he's looking good. And the idea is for him to become the wide receiver 1, but that may not happen in this first season. We know that Christian Kirk has been the top target for Trevor Lawrence throughout his entire career in the NFL. Kirk's actually averaged 7.5 targets per game with Lawrence throughout his career. And just some fun stats on this, Dave, because there's a lot of people out there that just love data. Check this one out. In 2023, over 73% of the wide receivers who averaged 7.5 targets finished as a top 24 wide receiver. Now, let's say Christian Kirk gets even 1 more target per game, 8.5 targets, based on his current career average with Trevor Lawrence. 93% of those wide receivers finish as a top 24 wide receiver. And so you're telling me that there is at least a 70% chance that this guy finishes as a top 24 wide receiver, at least historically, or at least from last season, or at least from what he's been doing with Trevor Lawrence in his career. We're making a few jumps there, but we have seen Christian Kirk finish pretty high in the past in fantasy football. And especially if he's going to be going at pick 87. Dave, I absolutely love that value. I think most people would be ecstatic to have him as their wide receiver 3. And I don't know, it kind of seems like on ESPN, you're able to get him even as a wide receiver 4. You can build out your team with a top quarterback, top tight end, some top running backs, and still get some excellent value here with Kirk.
Yeah, and this is going to be a show where we're going to agree a lot. This entire series, when we start doing Yahoo and CBS and NFL.com and Sleeper, we're going to agree a lot because these are our consensus opinions based on these platforms ADP. So I don't want you to watch the show and just think that Alfredo and I are just, patting each other on
Oh,
the
we
back
hate
for
each
having
other.
great dates here. But just the nature of this show is going to be a lot of agreement, and I do agree with you. I think the detractors from Christian Kirk, are that he doesn't really have a super high ceiling. But the usage is there. And in order to hit that ceiling, all he needs is some touchdown variance to go his way. If the usage is going to be there and the receptions are going to be there and the yardage is going to be there, he might not ever be a 1,400, 1,500 yard type of receiver. But if he can fall into the end zone a little bit more than we expect, then all of a sudden you're getting a top 15, top 20 season out of him and you're drafting him for super cheap. So, um, Kirk is one of those guys that kind of falls in that boring tier of wide receivers, but we know that the usage is going to be there. Obviously, Brian Thomas could come on later in the season and cut into that a little bit, but they play such different roles where Christian Kirk likes to operate in the middle of the field and get a high target share. Brian Thomas is going to be more of an outside the numbers, stretching the field type of guy. So even if Brian Thomas does come on and become a good wide receiver, although it might negatively impact Christian Kirk's usage a little bit, but it should boost his efficiency given their complementary play styles.
Yeah, and just to give an idea of what the ceiling can be with Kirk, wide receiver 11 in 2022. We know that there's a top 15 ceiling there. Is it likely? Maybe not as likely, but there is a ceiling there. And to get him in the 8th round, I think is just it's ridiculous. All right. We've been super positive about these players. We love these players. They're all great values. Let's go the opposite direction here, Dave. And we'll move a little quicker through these. Who are some of these players that are overvalued? They're not, honestly, looking at the list, they're not crazy overvalued. Like these aren't egregious here, but there's some players that we're kind of looking at the ADP and going, I'll pass. The first guy on this list, Michael Pittman Jr., wide receiver for the Indianapolis Colts.
Yeah, and there's an 8 spot difference between where he's getting drafted on ESPN and what our consensus rankings are. And then I'm pretty much in lockstep. I've got Michael Pittman as the 31st player off the board. Football Guys consensus has him as 32nd, but on ESPN he's going as the 24th player off the board, which means if you want Michael Pittman, you're investing a second round pick in him. And I get it. Like the usage has been there. He was 4th in the league in target share last year, 8th in the league in targets per route run. Um, but he just has a role that gives him such a little ceiling. Like he doesn't run a lot of downfield routes. Last year, air yard share was 25th in the league. His average target depth, how far he was getting downfield on the average target that was coming his way was 7.9 yards. That was 86th among wide receivers. So he's a guy who's going to gobble up a lot of targets, making him a little bit more valuable in PPR leagues. But now we're looking at a slightly different offense. I think Anthony Richardson is underrated as a passer, but I don't think they're going to throw quite as much with Anthony Richardson as they did with Gardner Minshew. Now they've also got a healthy Jonathan Taylor coming into the season as well. So I'm thinking that the sliders start to up the pass rate a little bit or up the run rate a little bit, which would, negatively impact the pass rate. We're also looking at Anthony Richardson, who we know has a big arm, might be willing to push the ball a little bit further downfield. They added AD Mitchell, and I know he's been struggling in camp so far, but he could come on and, kind of hurt the target share for Michael Pittman a little bit. And then the other big thing is Josh Downs, a guy who unfortunately is dealing with an injury right now, but a guy who is just been a target hog, and he does operate in a similar part of the field as Michael Pittman. So there's a lot of red flags here where Michael Pittman, it's not that I think he's going to crater your team by any chance, but drafting a guy in round 2, I want to see that ceiling where he could potentially be a top 5 guy. And I don't think Pittman has that anywhere near his range of outcomes.
Yeah, you talk about those ceilings, right? Going back over the past 3 years, Pittman was wide receiver 15, wide receiver 23, and wide receiver 15. And then on ESPN, he's being drafted as the wide receiver 12 overall. He's being drafted above any finish he's had in his career. We've seen the ceiling,
Yep.
and he's being drafted well above that. And like you said, second round, he has to be the second player that you are drafting. You are
Yep.
putting all your eggs in that Michael Pittman basket. And boy, that's a lot. If you're already struggling with believing in Anthony Richardson or this Colts offense, or hey, maybe you're a big believer in Jonathan Taylor. Is there going to be enough football to go around for these guys, for Michael Pittman to be a guy that carries your offense, your fantasy football team? I don't think so.
And for
Not at the
me,
second pick.
just adding context to this and like actual actionable advice, like where Pittman is going right now. is in the same range as Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen and Sam Laporta and Jalen Hurts. So you can get one of those, premium players at a onesie position instead of Michael Pittman. And then in the next round, come back. A guy that I haven't been crazy about is ADP on underdog, but like Drake London. You can get Drake London in the next round. You can get Mike Evans. You can get Nico Collins. You can get DK Metcalf. All guys that project similarly to Michael Pittman, have arguably higher ceilings. So for me, it just comes down to like passing on Pittman and getting a guy in the next round that will ideally give you pretty similar production.
All right, the next guy that I'm going to talk about here, James Cook, running back for the Buffalo Bills. And if you've been listening to the show or watching this show before, you know that I have professed my love for Ray Davis many, many, many times. And I'm going to avoid doing too much of that here. For me, the big thing with James Cook is that right now we've got him as our consensus 43rd player, someone that we would take in the fourth round. ESPN has him as the 29th player, someone that's going in the mid third. There's a difference of 14 spots there. So a little bit over a round. Like we said with these, it's not egregious. It's not something that we wouldn't do. It's something that we prefer not to do. My worry with James Cook is that he was highly efficient last season, and maybe he's going to continue his career as a highly efficient player, a guy who doesn't get on the field too much. He only went over a 60% snap share in just 2 games with Joe Brady as the offensive coordinator. And when he did get used a lot, he actually had his worst games of the season, which was just kind of weird.
Mhm.
It seems like he's going to be a Tony Pollard type of guy that needs to be relegated to a role where he is splitting, and that's where he becomes most efficient. That doesn't make him a bad player. It doesn't make him even a bad fantasy asset. It just makes him a player that I don't want to have to draft in the third round, potentially as my running back one for my team. That's what worries me the most. There was that stretch last year that James Cook had from week 11 to week 15, 4 games. He had 4 touchdowns. That really buoyed his fantasy stock during that time, because when you look at outside of that sandwich, he had some pretty rough fantasy performances there. Now the team brings in, who I mentioned earlier, Ray Davis, who is a rookie running back out of Kentucky. He's going to be good on passing downs, good in short yardage. You already now have an expanded group of pass catchers in Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel, Dalton Kincaid, all these guys who are actually not going to be field stretchers. They're going to be guys that are catching the ball around the line of scrimmage. And so I think that hurts James Cook a little bit. If this was a team where we're saying, man, Keon Coleman has developed and he's the downfield guy, maybe we're not as worried. But the fact that so many of these pass catchers all have some redundancies, it makes me a little bit more worried about James Cook. I'm worried about the efficiency sticking around. I'm worried about those high value touches, the touchdowns, the carries inside the goal line, and possibly losing some good passing work. He's my running back 17, Dave. I'd rather draft him in like the late fourth, early fifth, not where he's going currently in the third round.
Yeah, I'm completely with you. And I talked about James Cook a while back as a fade for me. I have him right now as a fourth or fifth round pick for a lot of the reasons that you talked to or talked about. We saw 2 years ago he was wildly efficient, like led the league in breakaway run rate, and he did that on a smaller role. And I think that's just what James Cook is built for. Like he's a good complementary back.
Right.
Last year when we saw him in a workhorse role, that efficiency fell off a cliff. So I think that we're going to see more of a split here where Ray Davis is going to be involved. And that's not like that doesn't mean that James Cook is going to be useless, but we're drafting him on last year's production, and he's probably going to be in a different role this year. We've seen them bringing in Leonard Fournette and Latavius Murray and Damian Harris and all these guys over the years because they don't want James Cook to be seeing 250 plus touches. The writing's on the wall, and last year they just couldn't really find another option. I think that they're going to this year. So, yeah, in complete agreement with you on James Cook.
All right, we'll go quickly through these because I don't like to sit here and be negative about players. I know it works for clickbaity stuff, but this is a very positive show. So let's keep going with the negativity, but we're going to do it fast. Brian Robinson Jr., running back for the Washington Commanders. Dave, that's the next player you want to talk about here. We at Football Guys have him somewhere around pick 98 in the ninth round. However, on ESPN, this is one of the biggest gaps we're seeing in differences. He's going in the seventh round, pick 81, a 17 spot difference here. So talk to us about this one.
Yeah, and I think this is just people who are like, yeah, he was really good last year and he's going to be really good this year without kind of looking at the context of the changes to this Washington Commanders offense. Sam Howell was there last year and they were always playing from behind and they were just running more plays than any other team in the NFL. And this year, I think that we see a change in philosophy. They've got a new coach, they've got a new offensive coordinator, they've got a rookie quarterback, they have Austin Eckler there now. It's just a completely different, like, this offense has been flipped on its head from last year. And I think with Brian Robinson, I think he's a good football player. I think he's actually an underrated running back, but we can't ignore that Austin Eckler is there now. And reports out of camp are that he is healthy and that he looks like the Austin Eckler of old. And we know that what Austin Eckler does best is in the receiving game. And Brian Robinson was very underrated as a pass catcher last year. Led the league in yards per reception for running backs, was fifth in the league in yards per route run. And that's because they didn't really have another guy to do that. It's very obvious now that Eckler is going to be that guy. So in addition to him losing out on the passing down work with Austin Eckler being there, Jaden Daniels is there, a guy who we even saw in his first preseason game is willing to just put his head down and run near the goal line. So Brian Robinson last year had a stranglehold on goal line work and passing down work. If both of those go away, he could be one of those dead zone running backs, the guys who project for a lot of workload, but all of that work ends up being in between the 20s rushing work and a very obvious lack of high value touches. So I like Brian Robinson, the football player, and I like the Commanders offense, but there are just a lot of red flags here where you end up drafting him and the work might be there, but he just ends up somewhere in that like 8 to 12 point per range area at the end of the season, doesn't have a lot of big spike weeks, and he's a guy that you can never really fully rely on.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of that. There's that spice that he could pop off the way a Gus Edwards did last year, right? If this Commander's offense is
If he
really
scores
good,
13 touchdowns,
that's
he could be good. And that's
right.
the out for almost any running back that you're drafted in rounds 8, 9, and 10, right?
Yeah, and that's it, right? Like this offense has to be really good. He's going to have to get a lot of goal line touches. Like you said, I like Brian Robinson Jr., the player. I even really liked Brian Robinson Jr., the fantasy player last
Yeah.
year. But
There
this
was a
year,
point at, like,
there's,
the midway point in the season, he was the RB3 at one point last year. Like, he
yeah,
was crushing it. Yeah.
I felt like a genius drafting Brian Robinson Jr. as like my running back three, and he was crushing. All those teams were undefeated. I felt so smart. And that did not last long. All right, let's go to the next player on here. I want to talk about CJ Stroud here, quarterback for the Houston Texans. And right now, football guys, we've got him consensus 55th player on ESPN. He's the 42nd player going in the fourth round. But Dave, honestly, I think you and I both agree here. He should be even much lower than the football guys consensus, much lower than the ESPN average draft position right now. And you and I are not drafting CJ Stroud as a top five quarterback. We're not even drafting him in the top 5 rounds. I might look at him in the 6th round is where I'd probably start to look. 7th round, I think, would be the sweet spot if I could, but I know that's not going to happen in drafts, which means I'm probably just out on CJ Stroud this year. I mean, I don't think there's a reason to be drafting him this high. He gives you a good floor. He is a very talented player. Once again, when we say that we don't want to draft a player at a certain value in drafts, it does not mean we think they are bad at football or that they're bad for the NFL. So the commenters who want to say these guys don't watch the game, they don't know that CJ Stroud is so good, he's about to pop off. That's not what we're saying here. We know he can. But last season, he only had 4 games as a top 10 fantasy quarterback. For all the records he broke and for as good as the offense was, it wasn't always great for fantasy for CJ Stroud. Now he's being drafted as a top 5 guy ahead of Anthony Richardson, ahead of Kyler Murray, ahead of Joe Burrow, all quarterbacks that I would take ahead of CJ Stroud. We get little to no rushing upside with CJ Stroud. He had 11 rushing yards per game. This guy, I mean, it's we're not going to see the same dynamic fantasy value that we'd see from a Kyler Murray or an Anthony Richardson. In fact, I don't know that the ceiling for CJ Stroud is any different than, let's say, a Dak Prescott or a Jordan Love, guys that are getting drafted 2 to 3 rounds later than him, Dave. So, like, when that's the case, and I look at that and I say CJ Stroud is not really any different than these other players that are going 2 to 3 rounds later, yeah, it's going to be a major avoid for me. And I'd much rather have one of these guys, Jordan Love, Dak Prescott. You and I both love Kyler Murray, who I would draft, in a heartbeat over CJ Stroud.
Yeah, we don't have to beat a dead horse here. We've talked a lot about CJ Stroud, like, very good football player, but he just needs,
The hype got out of control.
insane. Yeah, and he needs insane passing efficiency to pay off that ADP. So all the guys that you mentioned, like, I'd take Kyler Murray out of him in a vacuum, but knowing that you can pass on CJ Stroud and get Joe Burrow and Dak Prescott later, that's what makes it easy to pass on CJ Stroud in these ESPN drafts.
All right, we're going to go to our final four players here. We're going to be looking at some sleepers, and people categorize sleepers way differently. I mean, we've been in our own, football guy staffer chats where sleepers come up, and it is players that if drafts were 20 rounds long, that's where those sleepers are getting drafted. In some of these ESPN drafts, these are sleepers that are potentially going in the 11th round, 12th round, 13th round, because mostly these drafts are going to be 15 to 16 rounds deep. So Dave, why don't you kick us off here with Josh Downs, the wide receiver for the Indianapolis Colts, who, I mean, it's a nice little yin and yang for you. You said Michael Pittman was overvalued. Josh Downs here is a sleeper. So talk to us a little bit about him.
Yeah, this this is crazy to me, man. Josh Downs' ADP on ESPN is 248, which means like unless you're drafting in super super deep leagues, Josh Downs is going undrafted in almost every ESPN league. I have him as an 11th round pick. That's where I have Josh Downs valued right now. So, if you're in a 16 round league, 18 round league, you can get this guy for free in the final round of your draft on ESPN right now. Like I said, I've got an 11th round grade on him. And you look at Football Guys consensus rankings, we have a 13th round grade on him. So there's almost 100 spot ADP disparity between where Football Guys think Josh Downs should get drafted and where he's actually getting drafted on ESPN. And, we've talked about it a lot. I've made the comp to Jaden Reed that, like, if you remove touchdowns from the equation, Jaden Reed and Josh Downs had identical rookie seasons. Um, you know, I do get a little bit concerned about Michael Pittman, and I've voiced some of those concerns a little bit. And the main reason for those concerns is because of the emergence of Josh Downs. So I think this is one where ESPN drafters just have it totally wrong. They are blinded by touchdowns and don't care about guys who don't catch touchdowns. But I think that the gap between Michael Pittman and Josh Downs right now, which is almost over 200 picks, is the gap between these two players. And really, the way that my rankings have them fleshed out, there should be like a 4 to 5 round gap between these guys.
Dave, we saw when there was a little bit of that variance where Josh Downs was getting touchdowns from weeks 5 through 8 across those 4 weeks. He got 2 touchdowns, nothing crazy. We're not saying it's some sort of ridiculous variance, but he was then averaging 14 PPR points per game. That
Mhm.
was a guy that you could not only easily plug into your lineup, but he'd be a pretty easy wide receiver 3. And that was with the Colts having a lot of struggles, not really sure what the offense was able to do. And also, that's weeks 5 through 8 of his rookie year. That's a
Mhm.
guy who is still learning the game, not ingrained into the offensive system and a part of the offensive game plan. So the upside is absolutely there. And to just be undrafted feels like people are missing out. They
Yeah.
don't quite get it there. All right, next guy I'm going to bring up is Chase Brown, running back for the Cincinnati Bengals. And right now on Football Guys, we've got him as our consensus 108th player. So looking at late ninth round here, ESPN, the average draft position there, pick 130, the 11th round. That's a difference of 22 spots, nearly 2 full rounds. We've talked about this a couple times. Dave, Zach Moss should not worry you if you are trying to draft Chase Brown at his value. It's another one of those guys that I say he's a middle management guy in a CEO role. It's not going to last. We see what happens every time one of these guys, like an Alexander Madison or a Mike Davis or anyone, ends up in a spot they probably shouldn't be in. They don't last. And the next guy who can step in and make plays, everyone falls in love with him. And Chase Brown, he's got a little bit of that Austin Eckler, Jalen Warren type to him. Major explosive plays. He's one of these guys. He was 8th in fantasy points per touch last year amongst running backs in 2023. That's a guy that if he can get any semblance of volume here, we're looking at a guy who's going to be some really good value. I mean, Joe Mixon was top 12 running back for the Bengals last season in fantasy points per game. And I mean, you've talked about it before where the efficiency was not great. I know that you like him this year for Houston, so it does change year by year. But if Brown can finish, I'm not saying he needs to finish the top 12 running back points per game, but if he's finishing anywhere near the top 24, not only is he an incredible value, but he possibly becomes a league winner for your team where you found value in so many other places. To go and draft Chase Brown in the 11th round is just fantastic for your fantasy team.
Yeah. I mean, Chase Brown is a guy that I have right now as a 7th round pick, is where I would be drafting Chase Brown. And again, you got to take ADP into consideration a little bit so you can kick it down a little bit. You don't have to draft him in the 7th round on ESPN, but just a huge value. Right now, he's my RB 27. And I've got him just behind DeAndre Swift and Aaron Jones. I've got him ahead of Brian Robinson, Ezekiel Elliott, Javonte Williams, Raheem Mostert. He's a guy who was third in the league in breakaway run rate last year, behind only Devon Achane and Keaton Mitchell. He's on a good offense, and reports out of camp are that he is the RB1. And Zach Moss has not looked good. And this is a guy who I talked about. You look at what he did in college. The only player who saw more touches than Chase Brown in his final year in college was Bijan Robinson. Like, this is a guy who can handle a huge workload. Did it at the Big Ten, where he was playing against a lot of future NFL players. It's not like he was at some tiny little school racking up numbers. He did this at a Big Ten college, and he was productive. He's a lot bigger than I think people realize he is. So yeah, this is another easy pick for me right now. If you're drafted on ESPN and he's going in round 11, I wouldn't even take the risk there. Like, maybe wait till round 10. I'd be confident drafting him in the 8th or 9th round, because the ceiling is sky high for a player with his efficiency in this offense.
Yeah, he's going to have value even as a committee guy because of his explosive play ability and the receiving work. But if Zach Moss, who really hasn't proven that he can be the guy at any point in his career, if he misses time, Chase Brown, I can see it right now, Dave. I can see it. Chase Brown ends up being one of those guys we're talking about, like in week 3, waiver wire. He's your priority pickup. He just had this big game. He's only rostered in 60% of leagues. And yeah, it becomes one of those big changes that we see. All right, let's go to the next guy here. It's another running back, Khalil Herbert, running back for the Chicago Bears for now.
Yeah.
For now, let's
Yeah.
see where he ends up. Right now, football guys, we've got him as a 15th round pick, consensus 169. So that's for most people, it's like last round. ESPN, he is undrafted, but just like firmly undrafted. We're talking pick 251, an 82 pick difference. I
Shocker
I got to
that I
see
went
what, yeah,
super deep with my sleepers, right?
and a bear.
Well, again, for now. But Khalil Herbert, I think right now that's what people look at, is like they look at the depth chart and they see that Khalil Herbert's listed as the RB3 on the depth chart. They see the weird usage where he had 9 touches to DeAndre Swift's 2 touches, and don't really know what to make of that. Like, are they showcasing him for a trade? Is he better than we expect? There's so many conclusions you can draw from that kind of wacky usage. But at the end of the day, Khalil Herbert is just a good running back. Last year, 19th in the league in yards per touch, 12th in the league in breakaway run rate. He's not the most athletic guy. He's not the biggest guy, but he just has a natural ability to just find the lanes and find the creases and make big plays out of what appears to be nothing when he gets the ball in his hand. And like you said, we've kind of joked a few times, like, for now, well, he could get traded. Dallas, there's a lot of other teams out there. Could be another potential where a good team, has a running back go down with an injury, and we look at a trade deadline sort of scenario here. As it seems at the moment, he's probably the odd man out in Chicago, but things can change quickly. And he is just a talented running back that you can pick up for free and stash at the end of your bench and hope that situations could change. Also, if DeAndre Swift gets injured or if Roschon Johnson gets injured, then all of a sudden he's in a bigger role. You don't necessarily need a trade for him to break out. There's multiple paths for him to find himself in a relevant role this year, and you can draft him literally for free in the very last round of your draft.
I love Khalil Herbert, kind of always have, even when he was coming out of Virginia Tech. Last season, we saw him, Dave. I'm looking at it right now, 4 finishes in the top 24. And let's go even a step further, 3 finishes in the top 10. Like, this is a running back that when he has opportunity, he can get it done. I think just the injuries sort of derailed him last year. The Bear staff knows how good he is. So if he's there, like you said, there can be a path to relevancy. If he's not there, oh man, get all aboard the rocket ship, Dave. Because if he's a Dallas Cowboy, I'm just gonna lose it. All right, I tried really hard here because I almost went with another Khalil. I had to stop myself from talking about Khalil Shakir for the 648th time on this show. So I went in a different direction here. Imagine picking all of your best skill players in your draft, not having to worry about quarterback, waiting all the way until the very end, and being able to draft a potential top 12 quarterback with your very last pick. I'm talking about Geno Smith, quarterback for the Seattle Seahawks. And right now, football guys, we've got him as a consensus 14th round pick. ESPN, he is firmly undrafted. We're talking about a difference of nearly 50 spots here between ESPN ADP and Football Guys rankings. I don't understand what's going on here, Dave. He's going as the quarterback 28. Quarterback 28. Like, I get it if maybe you don't think he's a top 15 quarterback, top 18 quarterback. Maybe you don't think he's a top 20 quarterback. But to be putting him behind JJ McCarthy, who, by the way, JJ McCarthy, just we got news that there's a meniscus injury. We don't know anything else other than that he's being evaluated for what that could be. So I'm sure that's going to obviously change. But then Geno Smith is also behind Bo Nix and Will Levis in ADP, which is just insane to me. This is the guy who was quarterback 5 just over a year ago. In 2022, he was the quarterback 5. And the big reason that he was so good that year was that he was able to be himself with Dave Canales. He was able to chuck the ball deep. He threw 15 touchdowns of 20 plus air yards. Quarterback 5. Just throwing that out there one more time. Then last season, everything kind of changed. We saw Dave Canales leaves. The offense doesn't look quite as good under, it was Shane Waldron, right, Dave? Just want to confirm there.
In Seattle?
Yeah, last year.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So under Shane Waldron, offense doesn't look quite as good. We're not taking as many deep shots. And Geno Smith only throws 5 touchdowns of 20 plus air yards. He's not doing the same thing, but even in a down year, he finishes at quarterback 19. So this ADP of quarterback 28 is just insane. It's got to be an oversight. There's got to be an error or something in the app because this is just nuts. Now you bring in this new offensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb, coming from Washington, where Michael Penix and Rome Odunze, Jalen McMillan, and Jalen Polk all had phenomenal seasons. We're going to see a lot more of these vertical plays, these big explosive plays. This is the perfect system for Geno. I think we're going to see a big step from Jackson Smith-Njigba. And mind you, I'm saying all this stuff about big, deep plays and explosive, whatever. There's still actually some decent rushing side with Geno Smith, okay? This was a guy who was 8th amongst quarterbacks in rushing in 2022. So that's sort of just the cherry on top. So for me, I'm not saying, hey, you're going to win your league because of Geno Smith because he's going to be a top 5 quarterback like he was previously. But if he can be a top 12 quarterback and you don't have to worry about drafting him until your very last pick of your draft, that's phenomenal value.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, this guy that we just saw 2 years ago with a great season, you kind of hit everything on the head, but it's going to be a better offense with really good playmakers surrounding him. I'm probably not drafting Geno Smith as a QB1, but we talk about a lot of these guys that we like that we're throwing darts on early. Jaden Daniels and Caleb Williams, and of course, like we're looking at the best case scenarios when talking about these guys, but the reality is they could just be busts. That could happen to any quarterback. So I think if you take a guy like that, Jaden Daniels or Caleb Williams, early in your draft, you pair him up with a guy like Geno Smith, who has a much higher floor, probably doesn't have the same ceiling as a guy like Jaden Daniels, but a much higher floor and can kind of be a safe play to get you through the early parts of the season while you're waiting on these rookies to warm up.
And it's not just Geno Smith. There's other quarterbacks looking right now that are going really, really late. Trevor Lawrence, pick 152. Justin Herbert, 154. Deshaun Watson, 158. Matt Stafford, 166. Baker, 172. Bryce Young, 197. It keeps going on and on and on. And maybe if you do want to take like one of those like true upside picks, Justin Fields and Geno Smith become something. If you're just kind of a sicko at quarterback, like there's a lot that you could do here. Daniel Jones, I almost couldn't say it, but Daniel Jones is there as well. I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot you can do here.
Just 2 years ago, it's not out of the question.
I know. But that's why I'm saying like this, it becomes one of those sneaky value plays that you can do here late with quarterback. All right. Well, we did it. We went through the best cheat codes to win in your ESPN fantasy football leagues. We're going to be back again tomorrow with the cheat code to win in your Yahoo fantasy football leagues. We're going to be doing the exact same thing, looking at overvalued, undervalued, and sleepers based on the average draft position there. Thank you guys so much for watching, listening all the way through. We're going to keep doing this throughout the week. For myself, for Dave, thank you guys. We'll see you next time. Adios.